February 7, 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz stood in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, trying to maintain his composure as Hitler outlined yet another dramatic shift in naval strategy. The newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine had been summoned to discuss the growing crisis in the Atlantic, where Allied convoy defenses were steadily improving and U-boat losses were mounting. But rather than addressing these urgent concerns, Hitler was fixated on a single bewildering concept: the conversion of Germany's remaining large surface vessels into floating anti-aircraft platforms. The battleships and cruisers must be stripped of their main armament, Hitler insisted, jabbing at the maps spread across the massive oak table. Replace the turrets with batteries of anti-aircraft guns. Station them in Norwegian fjords, the Baltic, and the Mediterranean as defensive platforms. Dönitz felt a cold wave of disbelief wash over him. The proposal was beyond merely wasteful. It represented a fundamental misunderstanding of naval warfare and would effectively eliminate what remained of Germany's surface fleet as an offensive force. Yet the Führer's expression made it clear this was not a suggestion but a decision already made. As the winter light faded outside the tall windows of the Chancellery, Dönitz realized he was witnessing one of the most catastrophic strategic blunders of the naval war, a decision that would accelerate Germany's defeat at sea and cripple operations in the vital Mediterranean theater, where every naval asset was already stretched to the breaking point. The Mediterranean had never been central to German naval planning before the war. The Kriegsmarine, rebuilt under the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty and later the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, had focused primarily on operations in the North Sea, the Atlantic, and the Baltic. The Z Plan, Hitler's ambitious naval construction program approved in 1939, envisioned a fleet capable of challenging Britain's Royal Navy for control of the Atlantic sea lanes. But even this grandiose scheme had paid little attention to the Mediterranean. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, responsibility for naval operations in the Mediterranean had been assigned primarily to the Regina Marina, Italy's substantial but technologically outdated navy. German naval involvement had been limited largely to U-boat operations from bases in southern France and occasional forays by auxiliary cruisers. But as the war progressed and Italy's naval capabilities proved inadequate, the Kriegsmarine found itself increasingly drawn into Mediterranean operations, committing precious resources to a theater for which it had never properly planned. Captain zur See Werner Hartenstein stood on the bridge of his submarine U-156 as it slipped through the Strait of Gibraltar in the darkness of January 1943, beginning yet another dangerous patrol into the Mediterranean. At 44, Hartenstein was one of the Kriegsmarine's most experienced U-boat commanders, with 13 confirmed merchant sinkings in the Atlantic. Now, like many of Germany's best submarine captains, he had been reassigned to the Mediterranean, where Allied control of the air and increasingly effective anti-submarine measures made operations extraordinarily hazardous. The decision to concentrate U-boats in the Mediterranean, rather than the Atlantic, had been controversial within the Naval High Command. Admiral Dönitz had argued vehemently for maintaining focus on the Atlantic campaign, where German submarines had been wreaking havoc on Allied shipping. But Hitler, increasingly prone to micromanaging military operations, had insisted on diverting substantial U-boat strength to support Rommel's forces in North Africa and to interdict Allied supplies to Malta and Egypt. The result was a dispersion of Germany's most effective naval asset, its submarine fleet, at precisely the moment when concentration of force might have achieved decisive results in the Battle of the Atlantic. As Hartenstein's U-boat penetrated deeper into the Mediterranean, the harsh realities of operating in this theater became immediately apparent. Unlike the vast expanses of the Atlantic, where a submarine could often hide for days without detection, the Mediterranean was a confined space with relatively shallow, clear waters that made concealment difficult. Allied air patrols from Gibraltar, Malta, North Africa, and aircraft carriers maintained near-constant surveillance. The Mediterranean's geographical constraints created natural choke points where Allied anti-submarine forces could concentrate their efforts. For U-boat commanders accustomed to the relative freedom of Atlantic operations, the Mediterranean was a claustrophobic killing zone where survival often seemed a matter of luck rather than skill. "We are no longer hunters," Hartenstein remarked grimly to his first officer as they dove to escape an approaching patrol aircraft. "In these waters we are the hunted." The decision to commit significant U-boat resources to the Mediterranean was just one manifestation of a broader strategic failure in German naval planning. By early 1943, Hitler's erratic interventions in naval strategy had created a situation where the Kriegsmarine was attempting to fulfill too many missions with inadequate resources, its efforts dispersed across multiple theaters without the concentration necessary for decisive success in any of them. The surface fleet, never rebuilt to the strength envisioned in pre-war planning, had been further weakened by losses and Hitler's growing distrust of large surface vessels following the loss of the Bismarck in 1941. The remaining capital ships, the battleship Tirpitz, the pocket battleships Admiral Scheer and Lützow, and the heavy cruisers Prinz Eugen and Admiral Hipper, were increasingly confined to Norwegian fjords, their activities limited by fuel shortages and Hitler's reluctance to risk their loss. Now, with his bizarre directive to convert these vessels into floating anti-aircraft platforms, Hitler was effectively removing them from the war at sea entirely. In the headquarters of the Mediterranean U-boat command at La Spezia, Italy, Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock reviewed the latest intelligence reports with growing concern. The veteran U-boat commander, who had once terrorized Atlantic shipping as captain of U-96, later immortalized in the novel and film Das Boot, now faced the unenviable task of directing submarine operations in an increasingly hostile Mediterranean environment. The reports before him painted a grim picture. Allied air and naval superiority was growing daily, convoy protections were increasingly sophisticated, and U-boat losses were mounting at an unsustainable rate. Most troubling was the evidence that the Allies were deploying new detection technologies, improved radar, more sensitive sonar, and aircraft equipped with powerful searchlights for night operations. Against these advances, the U-boat's primary defense, their ability to hide beneath the waves, was becoming steadily less effective. Lehmann-Willenbrock's concerns reflected a fundamental problem in German naval strategy: the failure to maintain technological parity with Allied anti-submarine capabilities. Early in the war, German U-boats had enjoyed significant technological advantages: better torpedoes after initial problems were resolved, more advanced hydrophones for underwater listening, and superior optical periscopes. But by 1943, this edge had been lost. Allied scientific development, fueled by the immense resources of the United States and the desperate innovation of Britain, had produced a series of game-changing technologies. Centimetric radar, capable of detecting a U-boat's conning tower even in darkness or fog. The Lee light, which allowed aircraft to illuminate submarines caught on the surface at night. Magnetic anomaly detectors that could locate a submerged submarine, and improved depth charges and Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars had collectively transformed the underwater battlefield. The German naval leadership had recognized these developments too late, and Hitler's persistent interference in technical matters had delayed crucial countermeasures. Perhaps the most egregious example of Hitler's mismanagement of naval affairs was his handling of the snorkel technology. This relatively simple device, essentially a breathing tube that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, had been developed by the Dutch Navy before the war and captured by Germany during the invasion of the Netherlands. Dutch submarine engineers had recognized its potential to revolutionize underwater warfare, as it would allow submarines to remain submerged indefinitely, charging batteries and maintaining propulsion without exposing themselves on the surface. German naval engineers had immediately recognized the value of this innovation and recommended its rapid adoption for the U-boat fleet. But Hitler, fixated on more visibly impressive technologies, like the massive Type 20 Maus electro-boats that would not be ready until the war's final months, had repeatedly delayed full implementation of the Schnorchel. By the time he finally approved its widespread adoption in late 1943, the technology that might have dramatically reduced U-boat vulnerabilities came too late to reverse the tide of the underwater war. Admiral Karl Dönitz, though now nominally in charge of the entire Kriegsmarine, found himself increasingly powerless to prevent Hitler's most damaging naval decisions. In a private meeting with his staff in February 1943, the frustration that he carefully concealed in Hitler's presence burst forth. "We are witnessing the systematic destruction of our naval capability through ignorance and whim," he told his assembled officers. "The directive to convert our battleships and cruisers to anti-aircraft platforms is merely the latest example. These ships represent years of construction effort, massive industrial investment, and irreplaceable trained crews. To remove their main armament and anchor them as stationary targets is not merely wasteful, it is strategically suicidal." The Admiral's words reflected a growing despair among professional naval officers as Hitler's interference increasingly undermined what remained of Germany's maritime power. The Navy, unlike the Army or Air Force, had never been central to Nazi mythology or Hitler's strategic thinking. The Führer, an army corporal in the First World War, had little understanding of or interest in maritime affairs beyond their propaganda value. This fundamental disconnect between naval realities and Hitler's perceptions would have particularly devastating consequences in the Mediterranean theater. On the deck of the heavy cruiser, Admiral Hipper docked at Kiel for what had been described as modifications. Captain Zorzé Hans Hartmann watched with barely concealed anger as shipyard workers began the process of removing the ship's main 203mm gun turrets. The Hipper, one of Germany's most powerful heavy cruisers, had been designed specifically to outgun the light cruisers of potential enemies while outrunning their heavier vessels. Its 8 8-inch guns in 4 twin turrets represented the core of its combat capability. Now, on Hitler's direct orders, these weapons, representing years of design work, manufacturing effort, and crew training, were being removed to make way for batteries of 105mm and 37mm anti-aircraft guns. The ship was being transformed from a flexible offensive weapon into a static defensive platform, and in the process was being effectively eliminated as a factor in the naval war. Hartmann, who had commanded the Hipper during successful operations in the Atlantic and Arctic, felt as if he were witnessing the deliberate crippling of a thoroughbred racehorse. "They might as well scuttle her," he remarked bitterly to his executive officer as they watched the gruesome technical dismemberment. "At least that would deny her to the enemy, rather than transforming her into a floating target." The conversion of Germany's remaining major surface combatants into anti-aircraft platforms represented a culmination of Hitler's increasing distrust of naval operations and his fundamental misunderstanding of maritime power. Following the loss of the battleship Bismarck in May 1941 and the Channel Dash of February 1942, when the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen were forced to flee from Brest to German ports under heavy British attack, Hitler had become convinced that large surface vessels were too vulnerable to justify their expense and the risk of their loss. Rather than recognizing that these problems stemmed from Germany's lack of naval air cover and insufficient supporting forces, issues that reflected broader strategic failures, Hitler had simplistically concluded that the age of the capital ship was over. His solution, typical of his increasingly erratic strategic thinking, was to repurpose these vessels for an entirely different role for which they were never designed. The practical impact of this decision on the Mediterranean theater was severe and immediate. The German surface fleet, already unable to challenge Allied naval supremacy in the Mediterranean directly, had nonetheless played an important role in tying down significant British naval assets. The mere existence of ships like the Tirpitz in northern waters forced the Royal Navy to maintain substantial forces in home waters that might otherwise have been deployed to the Mediterranean. With the neutering of these vessels as offensive threats, the British were able to redeploy additional warships to support operations in the Mediterranean, just as the campaigns in North Africa and Sicily were reaching their critical phases. In May 1943, when Allied forces completed the conquest of Tunisia, capturing nearly 250,000 Axis troops, the Royal Navy was able to commit forces to the operation that would have been unthinkable had the threat of German surface raiders remained credible. For the U-boat still operating in the Mediterranean, the consequences of Hitler's surface fleet decision were equally devastating, if less direct. With more Allied warships available for convoy protection and hunter-killer operations, the already dangerous environment for German submarines became even more lethal. By mid-1943, U-boat losses in the Mediterranean had reached catastrophic levels. Of the approximately 62 submarines committed to Mediterranean operations during the war, 41 would be lost, a destruction rate of 66%, far higher than in any other theater. Hartenstein's U-156, which had slipped into the Mediterranean in January 1943, would not survive to return through the Strait of Gibraltar. On March 8, 1943, a U.S. Catalina flying boat spotted the submarine on the surface off the coast of Tunisia and attacked with depth charges, killing all hands. It was a fate shared by dozens of Germany's most experienced submarine commanders and crews, their loss representing not just the destruction of irreplaceable naval assets, but the squandering of years of accumulated combat experience and expertise. The technical and strategic blunders in German naval policy had profound effects beyond the immediate military sphere. The Kriegsmarine's inability to maintain secure supply lines across the Mediterranean contributed directly to the collapse of the Axis position in North Africa. Rommel's Africa Corps and the Italian forces in Libya and Tunisia had always operated at the end of a tenuous logistical lifeline. Even at the best of times, nearly 30% of supplies dispatched to North Africa were lost to Allied action. By early 1943, with Allied air and naval superiority firmly established, this figure had risen to over 60%. Tanks, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies and reinforcements that German factories had produced at great cost were being sent to the bottom of the Mediterranean in an exercise of strategic futility that exemplified the broader failure of German war planning. The human cost was equally severe. Thousands of German and Italian troops were lost in sunken transports, many of them young replacements who drowned without ever seeing combat. In Rome, at the headquarters of German naval forces in the Mediterranean, Vice Admiral Eberhard Weichold contemplated the increasingly desperate situation with the cold realism of a professional officer. Weichold, who had served as German naval attaché in Rome before the war and had an intimate understanding of the Mediterranean strategic complexities, recognized that the naval war in this theater was effectively lost by early 1943. The decision to convert Germany's remaining capital ships to anti-aircraft platforms, removing them permanently from any potential Mediterranean operation, was merely the final confirmation of a defeat that had been months in the making. In his detailed reports to Berlin, Weichold had repeatedly warned that without a fundamental reconsideration of Mediterranean strategy, including a substantial increase in naval and air assets or a complete withdrawal to more defensible positions, catastrophe was inevitable. His warnings, like those of many professional officers, had been ignored or dismissed as defeatist. Now, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Sicily, the obvious next step after the North African victory, Weichold found himself presiding over what amounted to the managed dissolution of German naval power in the Mediterranean. The invasion of Sicily, launched on July 10, 1943, represented the Allied exploitation of the maritime superiority that Germany had effectively ceded through years of strategic and technical mismanagement. Operation Husky involved over 2,500 Allied vessels, a naval armada of overwhelming power that the Axis had no means to counter effectively. The remaining German naval forces in the Mediterranean were reduced to insignificant harassment actions and increasingly desperate attempts to evacuate troops from the doomed island. When Italy surrendered in September 1943, following Mussolini's overthrow in July, the strategic situation deteriorated further. The Italian fleet, which had represented the bulk of Axis naval power in the Mediterranean, despite its technological limitations, was now lost. Several Italian warships were sunk by German aircraft while attempting to reach Allied ports, but most successfully defected, depriving Germany of even the secondary naval presence that the Italian alliance had provided. The collapse of the Axis position in the Mediterranean by late 1943 cannot be attributed solely to Hitler's decision to neutralize Germany's surface fleet, of course. It was the culmination of years of strategic missteps, technical delays, and resource misallocations. Yet this decision stands as perhaps the most emblematic example of the fundamental failures in German strategic thinking. It reflected Hitler's growing detachment from military reality, his tendency to make dramatic changes in strategy based on momentary impulses rather than careful analysis, and his fundamental misunderstanding of naval warfare. The decision came at precisely the moment when Germany needed to maximize the effectiveness of its remaining naval assets, not neuter them. It represented a surrender of offensive capability and strategic flexibility at a time when both were desperately needed. For the men who served in the Kriegsmarine's Mediterranean forces, the consequences of these high-level failures were measured in sunken ships, lost comrades, and ultimately futile sacrifice. Oberleutnant zur See Karl Schmidt, who served as a watch officer on U-453 during operations off the coast of Algeria in early 1943, would later write, "We knew the odds against us were nearly impossible. The skies belonged to the enemy, the waters were too clear and too shallow for effective evasion, and our missions often seemed designed more for propaganda than military effect. Yet we continued to sail, to fight, and too often to die." It was only later, after the war, that we learned how many of our difficulties stemmed not from the enemy's strengths, but from our own leadership's failures. Schmidt's U-453 would be sunk by British destroyers near Crete in May 1944, with only one survivor from its crew of 51, one more statistic in the catalogue of losses that marked Germany's failed Mediterranean campaign. The technical dimension of Germany's naval failure in the Mediterranean deserves particular attention, as it reflects broader issues in the Nazi approach to warfare. Throughout the conflict, German naval technology had emphasized quality over quantity, a necessary approach given the Reich's limited industrial capacity compared to the Allied powers. Early in the war, this had resulted in submarines and surface vessels that were individually superior to many of their Allied counterparts. But as the conflict progressed, this advantage was steadily eroded by Allied technical innovation and mass production. By 1943, the failure to develop effective countermeasures to Allied radar, sonar, and aerial surveillance had rendered German naval operations increasingly vulnerable. The Mediterranean, with its clear waters and excellent conditions for aerial reconnaissance, magnified these vulnerabilities. Yet Hitler's technical focus remained fixed on wonder weapons and massive prestige projects, rather than the incremental improvements and countermeasures that might have preserved German naval effectiveness. The snorkel technology that might have dramatically reduced U-boat vulnerability to aerial detection was particularly relevant to Mediterranean operations. In the confined waters of the Mediterranean, where submarines were rarely far from Allied air bases, the ability to remain submerged indefinitely while running diesel engines would have been invaluable. Dutch naval engineers had developed the technology specifically for operations in confined, shallow waters, similar to the Mediterranean environment. When German forces captured Dutch submarines equipped with snorkels in 1940, naval technical experts immediately recognized their potential and recommended rapid implementation across the U-boat fleet. But Hitler, uninterested in what seemed a mundane technical modification compared to more dramatic projects, repeatedly delayed approval. By the time the technology was finally deployed in significant numbers in late 1943 and 1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. Dozens of U-boats and their irreplaceable crews had been lost in the Mediterranean during the crucial months when snorkels might have provided them with a fighting chance at survival. The human dimension of the Mediterranean naval war often receives less attention than the grand strategic failures, but it is perhaps the most poignant aspect of the campaign. The men who served in German naval forces in this theater, submariners, surface ship crews, naval aviators, and the support personnel who maintained their vessels and equipment, faced some of the war's most challenging conditions. The Mediterranean's climate, with its intense summer heat and humidity, made life aboard submarines particularly hellish. Cramped quarters became unbearable as temperatures inside the pressure hulls routinely exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Fresh water was severely rationed, hygiene became impossible, and food spoiled rapidly. The psychological strain of operating in what amounted to a massive trap, with limited escape routes and overwhelming enemy superiority, added to the physical hardships. Yet these men continued to fight with remarkable determination, even as it became increasingly clear that their sacrifices could not alter the war's outcome. Obersteuermann Wolfgang Luth, who served as the chief helmsman aboard U-331 during its Mediterranean operations in 1942 and early 1943, captured the grim fatalism that pervaded the German naval forces in his diary. "We sail because we are ordered to sail. We fight because it is our duty to fight. We die because it seems increasingly inevitable that we will die. The sea is beautiful here, crystal clear, deeper blue than the Atlantic, warm in a way that would be pleasant under other circumstances. We joke that at least our graves will be in beautiful waters. Dark humor is all that remains to us now." Luth's U-331, after surviving numerous close calls, was finally sunk by the British destroyer HMS Wrestler off the coast of Algeria in November 1942. Luth was one of the few survivors spending the remainder of the war in a British POW camp. His diary, smuggled out at the war's end, provides one of the most vivid first-hand accounts of the Mediterranean U-boat war and the psychological impact of fighting in what increasingly seemed a hopeless cause. The collapse of Germany's Mediterranean naval position coincided with a broader crisis in the Kriegsmarine. May 1943 marked what German submariners would call Black May, when U-boat losses in the Atlantic reached catastrophic levels. 43 submarines sunk in a single month, with many more damaged. This crisis, which effectively marked the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic, was the direct result of the same strategic and technical failures that had undermined the Mediterranean campaign. The diversion of submarines to the Mediterranean had weakened the Atlantic effort at a crucial moment. The delay in implementing technical countermeasures to Allied detection systems had left the U-boat fleet increasingly vulnerable, and Hitler's erratic interventions in naval strategy, culminating in the neutering of the surface fleet, had eliminated what little flexibility remained in Germany's maritime operations. By the end of 1943, the Kriegsmarine had effectively lost the war at sea on all fronts. The post-war analysis of Germany's naval defeat would identify Hitler's 1943 decision regarding the surface fleet as a pivotal moment in the collapse. Admiral Dönitz, who survived the war to face trial at Nuremberg, would write in his memoirs, "The order to convert our remaining capital ships to anti-aircraft platforms represented not merely a technical modification, but a fundamental surrender of naval strategy. It signaled to the Allied powers that Germany had abandoned any pretense of contesting control of the sea lanes. In the Mediterranean, where our position was already precarious, it removed even the threat of intervention by major surface units, a threat that had previously forced the British to maintain substantial forces in readiness. It was, in effect, an admission of defeat disguised as a tactical adjustment." Other surviving naval officers were even more blunt in their assessments. Vice Admiral Helmuth High, who had commanded the cruiser Admiral Hipper earlier in the war, described the decision as the act of a military dilettante, demonstrating complete ignorance of naval warfare and contempt for the professional judgment of career officers. The legacy of Germany's Mediterranean naval failure extended well beyond the immediate military consequences. The loss of North Africa, and then Sicily, facilitated by Allied maritime supremacy, led directly to the Italian surrender and the opening of a new front on the European mainland. The resources that Germany was subsequently forced to commit to the Italian campaign, 25 divisions by early 1944, represented a massive diversion of strength from the Eastern Front at a time when the Reich was already struggling to contain the Soviet advance. These forces, which might have made a significant difference in the defense of the Reich's core territories, were instead scattered across the Italian peninsula in a campaign that was strategically peripheral but politically impossible to abandon once begun. The roots of this strategic overextension lay in the earlier failure to maintain effective naval power in the Mediterranean, which might have allowed for a more orderly and economical defense or withdrawal from exposed positions. For the German people, the naval defeats of 1943 in the Mediterranean and elsewhere marked a significant psychological turning point. The U-boat campaign had been one of the few German operations that had seemed to be succeeding at a time when the war on land was already turning against the Reich. Propaganda had celebrated the grey wolves of the submarine fleet and their successes against Allied shipping. The sudden and catastrophic reversal of fortune at sea, though downplayed in official communications, could not be entirely concealed. For a population already beginning to experience the reality of strategic bombing and aware of the disasters at Stalingrad and in North Africa, the collapse of the naval campaign represented yet another crack in the facade of potential victory that Nazi propaganda struggled to maintain. By late 1943, even many committed Nazi supporters had begun to recognize that the war was moving inexorably toward defeat. The strategic lessons of Germany's Mediterranean naval failure remain relevant for military planners and historians. The campaign demonstrates the critical importance of maintaining focus on core strategic objectives rather than being drawn into peripheral operations that disperse limited resources. It illustrates the dangers of political leadership interfering in technical military decisions without adequate understanding of their implications. Perhaps most importantly, it highlights the fatal consequences of failing to adapt rapidly to changing technological and tactical conditions. The Allied powers, particularly Britain, had entered the war with naval doctrine and technology that in many ways lagged behind Germany's innovations. But they demonstrated a capacity for adaptation and innovation that the increasingly rigid Nazi system could not match. By 1943, this adaptability had transformed initial disadvantage into overwhelming superiority. When Admiral Dönitz stood in the Reich Chancellery in February 1943, watching as Hitler outlined his plan to gut the German surface fleet, he was witnessing more than just another misguided tactical decision. He was observing the culmination of a pattern of strategic failure that would doom Germany's position at sea and accelerate the Reich's overall defeat. The Mediterranean, which might have been managed as a secondary theater with limited focused objectives, had instead become a quagmire that consumed irreplaceable resources. while achieving no decisive results. The decision to convert the remaining capital ships to anti-aircraft platforms was simply the final, most visible manifestation of a failure of strategic thinking that had undermined the German war effort from its earliest stages. It was, as one naval historian would later describe it, the moment when Hitler's direction of the naval war moved from the merely incompetent to the actively self-destructive. As we reflect on this critical turning point in the naval war, we are reminded of the essential relationship between strategic vision, technical innovation, and military effectiveness. The Mediterranean campaign, often overshadowed in popular memory by the more dramatic events on the Eastern Front or the D-Day landings, nonetheless represents one of the clearest examples of how flawed decision-making at the highest levels can undermine even the most professional military organizations and the most dedicated personnel. The German sailors, submariners, and naval aviators who fought and died in the Mediterranean were the victims not primarily of Allied superiority, but of their own leadership's fundamental failures of strategy and technology management. Their story deserves to be remembered not just as a chapter in the history of World War II, but as a case study in the consequences of strategic myopia and technical stagnation in the face of a rapidly evolving threat environment. If you have found this exploration of naval warfare in the Mediterranean compelling, consider how it illustrates broader principles of strategy and leadership that remain relevant in military affairs and beyond, how decisions made far from the front lines can shape the experiences and determine the fates of those who must implement them in the unforgiving environment of combat.